Hello everyone and welcome to my talk at this RSS workshop on topology and robotics. And today I want to talk about bridging topology and geometry and deformable object manipulation. So in this particular talk and in the work I'm going to present really focused on linear deformable objects for now. So things like ropes. And why do we care about ropes? Because being able to manipulate ropes and tying, for example, knots with them has very impactful applications in our life. So for example, when people are injured or in surgery, doctors need to stitch the wounds with medical sutures. This is a basic skill for the surgeon. Automating the step would allow surgeons to focus on more challenging things and potentially save more people. And rescue workers heavily depend on ropes and metal rods to rescue people from high-risk environments. So imagine if we could send in a robot to these environments, to these high-risk jobs, and if it could actually know how to tie knots with ropes autonomously. Okay, so let's make some steps towards this goal. And let's first talk about a first example of application of what we want to achieve. So here we have a goal image in a W shape, and we want a robot to be able to replicate that shape with a new rope that in a different environment that maybe looks completely different, has a different length and so on. And so here is a demonstration of what we can achieve with the system that I'm going to talk about in a bit. And so you see again, the goal image is done with some rope and some environment, and the robot is able to replicate the shape. Okay, this is actually quite a hard problem, although topologically it's maybe not yet so interesting. Bear with me, I'm going to come to topology later. So the reason why what you've just seen is quite a hard task is because there are different sources of uncertainty that basically always lead to the case where something different happens from what you expected, and so you have to replan. And so what are the sources of uncertainty? So here's a visualization of sources of uncertainty for specifically for perception. And so if we want to estimate the state of the rope that we are trying to manipulate or replicate, we first have to do that over a pretty high dimensional state of that rope. And also there might be occlusions during manipulation from the robot itself, and there might be wide variations of appearance of the rope itself, of the background and so on. And we want our strategy to manipulate a rope, of course, to be robust against all of these kinds of disturbances and sources of uncertainty. Another source of uncertainty that makes what I've just shown you pretty hard is in the dynamics of the rope. It is actually quite hard to predict how a rope will exactly evolve when you interact with it at some point, right? It really depends on the material properties of this rope and kind of what the bendiness of it is and so on. So this is another reason or another source for uncertainty with the effect that you cannot necessarily just open loop plan a manipulation sequence and hope that everything will go well. You actually have to continuously monitor what's going on and potentially replan. And our approach to this problem is a system that allows continuous replanning and also takes real-time feedback on the state of the rope into account, and it evaluates that with the current state of the rope with respect to the goal state always. So first of all, overall, we use a state space representation of the rope because, and this is what is described here in the MPC box of this with S1, S2, SK. And the reason why we basically use the state space representation is because it allows easier planning and an easier inclusion of any kind of physics priors, and it will later allow us to do easier planning of knotting and not just of moving the rope on a 2D plane into a particular shape. So we basically used MPPI, which is a work that was published by Evangelos Theodoros group at some point. So we used this for realizing NPC, and the dynamics model that we use to roll out how the robot is behaving when a robot interacts with it is a learned dynamics model that I will not talk so much about today. What I actually want to focus on today in this first part of the talk is the perception system that really allows us to robustly perceive this state of the rope in all these challenging conditions. So specifically at the center of this perception system is a differentiable renderer that uses a self-supervised objective function. And so this differentiable renderer, it uses an image as an input, and it produces an output state of the rope that you see here on the left of the slide. And you see there is a perception system in the middle that I'm not going to talk about too much, but there are also contributions in that one on how to represent the rope. Okay, so once we have this rope state estimated once, just pay attention maybe to the black arrows here. We actually render the state in this image with PUY, where basically each pixel's gray value corresponds to the probability that it's taken by or that is occupied by the rope. And then from this rendered state, we can form a mixture of Gaussians to model the foreground and the background color and compute the weights over the entire image again, given this Gaussian mixture model. All right, so now we have these two images, P and P new, and we use these two renderings and compute an image space loss, which we can backpropagate and either fine adjust the rope state itself, or even fine-tune the network weights to this particular maybe data set. So I want to emphasize here that this model, it doesn't assume anything about the color of the particular rope. The only thing it assumes is a good contrast, but it doesn't assume any known foreground or background color. These are really transient parameters that are estimated on the fly. And so here are some examples to show you how well this differentiable render works compared to other losses under visually very difficult situations. So in the first row here, for example, you have a manual initialization of the rope state, again, that may come from this perception network, for example, instead. And then using an L2 loss, you see that it works sometimes quite well, but there are also catastrophic failures under actually relatively simple visual situations. And then with our loss, we see that in the third row here, that our system is very robust despite occlusions and clutter in the image, and can estimate the rope state very well. And then further down, you have even more complex situations where you have either like a visually split case of the background, very different colors, or you have like not so high contrast, or you have even multiple ropes, and you see our system can actually estimate this quite robustly. And also our system can deal with intersection because it's actually tracking the state over time. And so you've already seen this movie of how this robot can basically reproduce the shape of the rope with this other rope in this other situation, because it uses a state space representation. And one thing I want to show here is that it's basically continuously replanning given the estimated rope state. And you can also see that although it can only manipulate or attach the end effector at one point of the rope, it does use the under-actuated dynamics of this rope to make a nice or to replicate that goal shape as good as possible and be as efficient as possible. So here, for example, it pushes one point, but it knows that the entire part of this rope will move in a favorable way to get closer to the goal. Okay, so just to summarize this, this work has been published at ICRA and RAL in 2020, actually, and it's called Self-Supervised Learning of State Estimation for Manipulating Deformable Linear Objects. And the main idea that we had here that is somewhat different from related work is that we really just stick to the state space representation and actually represent that rope with a set of nodes on it and their position instead of some learned latent representation. And the algorithmic contribution in that work is a differentiable renderer for self-supervised learning. Also, it allows us, we showed that it allowed us a robust state estimation. And putting everything together, including the model predictive controller, we have a system for manipulating deformable object into a given goal state under really big variations in appearance. Okay. So in this specific work that I introduced you to here, we focused on generalizable perception of ropes with the goal of changing the rope shape on a 2D plane. And the next step in our work was to actually look at, okay, how can we now get this rope into a shape that is more complex, in which we can get the rope into a state only through multiple rather complex manipulation sequences. So specifically, we looked at autonomous knotting of rope. And so, of course, as I already said, manipulating deformable objects such as rope is challenging in general because these objects have a very high-dimensional state and action space. A rope modeled by finite element method can easily have 100 degrees of freedom. On top of this, knot tying is more challenging than, for example, what I've showed you before, because knots are abstract topological concept and there is no analytical function that defines the distance to a goal. So, for example, for these two examples here, it is unclear how to quantify how far away each of these states on the left is from the goal state on the right. What makes things worse is tying a knot requires a long sequence of actions. Therefore, motion planning needs a long horizon and has an exponentially large search space. All right. So some previous work applied sampling-based motion planning to knot tying. And the work by Saha and Isto uses tree search, and they use knot theory to prune out unpromising branches. Still, we found that it actually takes just hours to find a single plan. And a more recent work generates visual plans by embedding images into a plannable latent space using something called causal infoGAN. And the latent space has a simple dynamics model, and plans can be generated by A-star search. However, this method has not been really demonstrated on knot tying. And so generally, this is just one example work, but there are other works on deformable object manipulation, and they are often trying to untie or unfold deformable objects. Here, however, we want to really tie a knot that requires quite some fine sensory motor control and also really good planning and replanning. So an alternative way compared to the work on the slide before is to learn the trajectories of knot tying by imitating a demonstration. And this work by Vandenberg and Miller learns and improves human demonstrations for a particular knot. But the learned trajectory cannot be used for other initial thread configurations or a different knot. So we propose a method that takes advantage of knot theory sampling-based motion planning, as well as learning-based methods. And knot theory helps us to decompose knotting tasks into steps, as I will explain later. Each step is a topological action. And this decomposition makes each step shorter, just easier to solve, and moreover, motion policies for each step can be reused for different knots. In fact, when humans teach knot tying skills, such as the instruction give on the right, we use very similar decompositions. Again, like decomposing makes it easier to solve, and it's reusable. And then we learn probabilistic motion policies for each step using reinforcement learning and imitation learning. Initializing the motion policies with imitating demonstrations helps bias exploration of reinforcement learning. And reinforcement learning allows unsupervised interaction on more diverse rope configuration and improves generalization on top of imitation learning. So at inference time, the motion policies for each topological step are used in a tree search to plan for the entire knot. So we would always find a solution, although the learned policies may not be perfect or may not be always successful. So here's an overview of the entire system that we're going to look at, and it has 3 levels. On the top level, we start from an untangled state on the left, and the goal topology is given on the right, and we decompose the knotting task into steps by searching for a path in this graph defined by topology. On the second level, we use learned motion primitives for each of the steps, and the motion primitives take the geometric configuration of the rope as input and predict distributions of robot motion trajectories that accomplish the required topological change. And during planning, we validate the success of the predicted robot motions in simulation and record the motion of the rope. On the bottom level, we try to reproduce the same rope motion on the real robot. And in our previous work that I've just started this talk with, we have developed a perception system or model that can estimate the geometric configuration of ropes from images, and a neural network rope dynamics model that is 40 times faster than the simulated ones. So we use this entire system and visual tracking, a model predictive control, to reduce the desired rope motion on a real system and then eventually tie a knot. So our method is able to plan for an overhand knot within 1 or 2 minutes and execute the plan on a real robot. So on the top right, we show an RGB input to the robot. In the middle, so this is so here's the generated motion plan. On the top right, we show the RGB image to the robot, and in the middle is the estimated rope configuration, and the orange arrow is the action being executed. The motion plan is adjusted between topological steps to improve robustness to the dynamics difference, or to the difference between simulation and the real robot, basically. Okay. Okay, so with our method, the motion primitives trained by tying an overhand knot can be used to plan a pentagon-like knot from the overhand knot. So in this example, the motion primitives find a motion plan within just a few minutes for this new knot. And so I'm now going to explain the technical details behind this work that I just showed you how it looks like when finished. To explain these details, we need to introduce the concept of topological states and topological actions. So topological states describe self-intersections in the 2D projections of a rope. The order of encountering intersections while traversing the rope, as well as the vertical ordering of which segment is on top of the other, are recorded as the topological state, just as shown here. And then topological states are an abstraction on the geometric states of rope. So imagine the geometric state space of the rope extends here over the whole screen, then topological states partition the continuous space into cells, and geometric states in each cell all have the same topological state. For example, this pair and this pair. And when we cross the boundaries, intersections are being formed or removed by executing topological actions. So going back to the graph we used on the first level of our proposed system, the graph nodes correspond to the cells, and the edges are the topological actions connecting neighboring cells. The first level of topological planning tells us the cells we need to go through. For example, we need to travel from the light blue cell to the dark blue cell to go from an untangled state to this particular knot. Okay, so in the second level, we want to find the robot motion trajectories for each of these topological actions. So in other words, we want to find a trajectory in this geometric state space that goes through two cells and satisfies the kinematic constraints of the rope and the robot. And we will learn the distribution of robot motion trajectories that can succeed at a given topological action, conditioned on the initial geometric state of the rope. So we limit the space of robot motion trajectories to splines with 3 control points. So one example of such a spline is shown here in green. And the robot will grasp the rope at the first control point of the spline, move along the spline, and release the rope at the third control point. The choice of letting the robot move along these splines reduces the long horizon RL problems to a banded problem, and therefore avoids instability issues with common RL algorithms, especially during training. Okay, so since there are many topological actions, we want to learn models that can generalize across these topological actions. And therefore we define topological motion primitives, TMP here, as the functions that take as input the rope geometric state and the topological action parameters and outputs a distribution over splines. And the splines are the trajectories that the robot end effector has to follow with the rope in hand. So we designed a joint representation of rope geometric state and the topological action parameters as the input to the motion primitives. And the representation helps the motion primitives learn the similarities of motion strategies we observed among human demonstrations of different topological actions and facilitate generalization across topological actions as well. Okay, so let me first explain the categorization of these topological actions and their parameterization. So there are 4 categories of topological actions. These are called R1, R2, R3. R stands for Reitermeister moves and this particular cross move that we denote by C. And within each category, there are many different actions. Here I draw some examples, and the 4 actions on the left are all R1 actions, so Reitermeister move 1. The first parameter here is all 0 here, which indexes which segment is used to form a new intersection. And the second parameter is the direction of the new loop shown on the top. The third parameter is the sign of the intersection shown on the bottom. The 2 actions on the right are both cross actions. The first 2 parameters index which segments are used to form the new intersection, and the third parameter is the sign of the new intersection. Okay, so these are the topological actions and their parameterizations. And there are 2 types of similarities that we observed, which will simplify learning here, or allow us to group different actions. The first type is based on spatial symmetry of the dynamics of the rope. Based on the symmetry, we can reduce some topological actions to others through just geometric transformation. For example, among the 4 topological actions shown here, we only need to learn a policy for the first one, and the other one we can just do through mirroring or rotation. Okay. The second type of similarities in motion policies is locality. When humans try to make an intersection with two segments of the rope, usually we will grasp the middle of the segment that will be on top and move towards the middle of the segment that will be underneath. We try to help the neural network learn these common strategies by encoding the rope geometric state in 3 parts. So let's take this cross action that you see on the top as an example. The first part of the segment that will be on top, the first part is the segment that will be on top of the new intersection. The second part is the segment that will be under the new intersection. And the third part copies the entire geometry of the rope to provide context for the task. For example, to avoid any undesired intersection. So each part then goes through an LSTM to extract features of this rope, and we use pairwise attention to exchange information between the parts. And then these features are further processed and merged to a single branch to predict the distribution of motion splines. So by using some of these geometric transformations and the 3-part representation that I just shown you, we can learn to solve all these topological actions by just basically grouping them together. And so we can learn all of these with just these 4 different topological motion primitives that all represent these many actions. To learn these motion primitives, we built on top of an algorithm called QT-opt and added an actor network because we found that CM cross-entropy method that is central to the algorithm QT-opt alone is not sufficient in this 6D action space that we have, which represents the spline that the robot has to track. So the actor network predicts the Gaussian distribution that initializes the CEM process, here denoted by A, and to collect demonstrations from a person. The demonstrator will see an image of the rope and then need to click on 3 points in the image to define the spline. And we add some Gaussian noise to the point coordinates to generate a batch of splines. And we simulate these splines and record whether they succeeded in the given topological action. So we first train the actor and critic on this collected data, which we call the imitation learning stage. And afterwards, we use the network to collect more data on a more diverse set of start configuration, as we normally do for reinforcement learning. And after each motion primitive is trained, we will chain them together according to the topological path for a specific knotting task. Remember the tree search, and fine-tune them jointly. And by doing this, we encourage the motion primitives to generate motions that not only succeed at the current topological action, but also makes the next topological action easier. So as you see here in this example, these are all valid solutions or to actually get the rope into particular topological configuration, but the middle one is preferred because it leaves enough space to actually grab on the ends of the rope and has an open enough loop to maybe thread something through it. So during inference time, because the motion primitives don't have 100% success rate, we use tree search to guarantee a solution. Starting with the current geometric state, we use topological motion primitives to sample robot motion splines and simulate the results. If the result does not have the desired topology, we discard the branch, select another node randomly, and grow another branch as shown here. Okay, so remember the green lines here, these are not ropes, these are actually robot actions, right, to get the rope into a particular state. So we trained and evaluated 8 topological actions. They are highlighted in this figure. And considering the physical thickness of the rope, we picked the actions with only a few intersections just to make it practical. And we collected human demonstrations on up to 8 geometric configurations for each topological actions. And in the first set of experiments, we wanted to verify 2 hypotheses. First, that using human demonstrations helps increase motion planning success rate and speed. And second, that reinforcement learning helps generalization on top of imitation learning. So we evaluate the success rate of motion spline samples drawn from the predicted distributions on unseen start configuration. As a naive baseline, we draw samples from a random uniform distribution which achieves less than 1% success rate on most topological actions. Only doing imitation learning performs reasonably well, but additionally, training with reinforcement learning can achieve a much higher success rate when planning knots using tree search. The higher success rates here translates to less time spent to find a successful plan. In addition, we have validated that using both actors and critics improves the success rates of topological actions. Only using critics performs poorly on the more difficult topological actions. We also see the actor-only method is consistently worse than using both networks, shown in green. We also evaluated a number of branches in the search tree before and after joint fine-tuning of motion primitives, and repeat the experiment for 50 random start geometries. The worst case search cost decreases a lot after we have done the fine-tuning. And so just to summarize, we approached this complex manipulation problem by first decomposing the complex knotting task into stages. And each stage will be easier to learn, and these stages can be composed to solve different knotting tasks. When learning for motion primitives for the topological action, we observe similarities of motion policies from humans and facilitate learning of the similarity by designing the joint representation of the rope's geometric state and the topological action parameters. For imitation learning and reinforcement learning, we use both actor and critic networks to improve the success rate. And joint fine-tuning of the topological motion primitives further improved the search space. So with that, I would like to thank you for your attention. I think my students, especially those who have actually worked on this work with Mongyuan, Li, and Yilin Zhu. And I also thank all my sponsors. And I would like to introduce the next speaker in this workshop, who is Tolga Burda and also comes from Stanford. He is postdoc in the geometric computing group, and his interest is in geometry, computer vision, and machine learning. His talk will be a geometric take on probabilistic synchronization. Thank you very much.